Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today we are talking about Phoebe. Is she a deacon? Is she a church leader? Did she was she the one of the first people to preach Romans and the scripture? We're talking about that today. Today I have someone who is written on this topic, on the topic of Phoebe, and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Mag Moscow. And today she's going to give us the inside scoop into the topic. So, how are you doing today, Miss Moscow?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Alrighty, so today we're talking about, of course, Romans 16. I'll read it real quick just so people have an idea. And most people probably have no idea what this is even like an important topic because it's just like a quick reference that most people aren't even familiar. Who is Phoebe of all people? So Romans 16, 1 to 2, I'll read it real quick. The verse, and I don't even know what translation this is. It says, I commend to you our sister Phoebe, a deacon of the church in Cenchrea. I ask you to receive her in the Lord in a way worthy of his people and to give her any help she may need from you, for she has been the benefactor of many people, including me. And that's the only mention in the entire biblical text of Phoebe, but she's actually very significant. So could you possibly, I don't know, take 3 to 10 minutes or whatever time you need to possibly just talk about her a little bit? What's the big debate about? What's the significance? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I still remember reading this verse for the first time after I'd been doing a bit of Greek, after I'd been reading Paul's letters in Greek for a while. And I just was up to Romans 16 and I read this and I saw the words that Paul was using. And I went, hang on a minute, she's a diakonos. And Paul is really consistent with how he uses this word. And I'd never even really heard of Phoebe before. And I was really excited. I remember telling my husband, wow, this woman is a diakonos. And considering how Paul uses this word, this is really significant. And then there's prostatus. And even the way that Paul uses the word sister and brother in his letters is quite significant.
Mhm.
And so she was like the first woman who I thought, no, she was someone significant in her congregation. She had a prominent role. She's been recognized. She's been commended to this church, and just the language that Paul uses is was yeah, it's significant. And so for quite a few years, I would say, well, this is my proof text, Romans 16, 1 to 2, of women in ministry.
Hmm.
And now I look more at Priscilla and even the elect lady in 2 John. I think they're even clearer. But for quite a few years, I was, yeah, this was, if you want to use a proof text, and I don't recommend using proof text, but this was it, Romans 16, 1 to 2. This woman had a really prominent role in the church in Cenchrea. Yeah.
Hmm. Okay. And could you possibly just talk about like what people are debating on this? Like
Mm,
there's deacon, like servant, and
yeah.
what are the other things? Like I guess yeah, what she's talking about. Like did she read the letter out loud, stuff like that?
Yeah. So she's called our sister, and people kind of gloss over that. They think, yeah, that's fair enough. But hopefully we can talk about that a bit. Then she's called Diakonos, and that is often translated as servant. And I don't mind if it's translated servant consistently. So when it's taught, so the Common English Bible translate this word as servant when it's referring to Jesus, when it's referring to Paul, when it's referring to Timothy. So if you want to be consistent, that's fine. But in some translations, like the King James and I think the New American Standard Bible, but don't quote me, it'll be it'll have a more slightly more lofty term, but then when it's Phoebe, it's suddenly she's a servant. And so that's a problem because we're not getting a true appreciation of her ministry.
Hmm.
And then the word prostatus as well. We know now that a prostatus was a patron, a benefactor, and these people were vital in first century society. People relied on these people. They had wealth, and there was a whole interconnected way whole interconnected relationships between patrons and clients. And, you know, if you're a prostatus, you've got wealth, which immediately means you've got influence and clout. And Paul says she was a prostatus of many, including Paul. So this wasn't a quiet woman in a church minding her own business, you know, handing out the hymn books. This was a woman who was prominent in the church. What else are they saying? Can't remember. One thing that everyone agrees on, though, is that she was the person who brought the letter from Corinth to Rome. I don't think anyone disputes that. And that, again, is because of the language that Paul uses. So there's a particular verb that Paul uses to the Romans, receive her, welcome her. And that word we see in lots of other ancient letters when someone's saying, look after this person who is delivering this letter, basically. Yeah.
Okay. And your specific views, do you think she was a leader? Did she like lead a church or something? What did she lead specifically? You know, did she preach and teach? And maybe any other views that are important there?
Yes, so we don't have that information, so I can only speculate, because Paul, apart from being a prostatus, doesn't elaborate on her ministry. But we know, again, from how Paul uses the other words, that the diaconoi delivered messages, that some, especially in, not Paul, but in the 2nd century, that they had a speaking ministry, that they handled finances, which I think Phoebe definitely did. I think Phoebe possibly sponsored Paul's letter. And letters were expensive. And okay, so when Paul's writing to the Romans, he's at Gaius's house. So Gaius is the guy, and we see this in Romans 16, Gaius is the guy who's having Paul in his house, looking after him in his house. So Phoebe's not giving him hospitality at this point in time. So how else could she be giving him support, financial support? And I'm really inclined to believe that Phoebe was the main sponsor of Paul's letter. Very expensive process. Randolph Richards, I think I wrote his name down. Yeah, Randolph Richards said that it would have cost $2,000 to produce this letter. So most poor people today in Western society think that really need to get their hands on $2,000, they can do it. But in the ancient world, like, the equivalent of $2,000 was unattainable for a lot of people. And, you know, writing out the letter was a long, involved process, writing on wax tablets. And Romans is a beautifully crafted letter, so it probably had gone through many, many drafts. It's written possibly by a professional scribe, amanuensis, called Tertius. I don't know if you saw just recently, but Candida Moss posted something, and she reckons that Tertius might even have been Phoebe's slave, which is a whole other thing.
Okay.
Yeah. And she wrote an article about it last year, but now there's sort of a more popular post about it going around. So I think Phoebe not only delivered the letter, I think she was personally invested in this letter. I think she might have been one of the main sponsors, and that was part of her role as prostatus. Or whether she did the roles that we see in a Sunday service, whether she got up to preach or to prophesy or to pray. I think she may well have done all of those things, but we just don't know. We just don't know. But her ministry was vital, I would say, in the church.
Yeah, and we'll get into more detail of the more solid things you can definitely argue about. So we've already read the 2 verses here, but Is there anything in the specific context, not the specific two verses, but maybe after it or before? Like this is, of course, like the end of a letter, and Paul's giving all these types of greeting. Is there anything else you wanted to add about like maybe the commend and receive language?
Yeah, so that prosdechomai verb that he uses, welcome Phoebe. I think it's worthy of the saints or something. It's used for Epaphroditus as well, in the Philippians, where Paul says, welcome him. And I think that's kind of all I want to say. But I could also mention that in the very next verse after Phoebe is another woman that's mentioned, and that's Priscilla. And I like to say that in Romans 16, there's a list of 28 Christians based in Rome, and Priscilla's first. So she's first of 28 Christians based in Rome at that time. And I think that's a pretty amazing thing for Paul to do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
There's
Yeah.
lots of women. Yeah, there's 10 women, at least 10 women in that list.
Right.
There's people we're not quite sure of. It's not really clear. I think it's Olympias. Is that a guy or a girl? Probably a guy. Yeah, there's at least 10 women in there. Yeah.
Okay, so the people that aren't familiar, what would be the significance or the oddity of women being in this list?
I don't think there is an oddity.
Okay.
So there's a scholar called Wayne Meeks. Well, there's not an oddity for Paul, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So he's observed that in Paul's undisputed letters, and that's like Philippians and Romans, that women are there in almost equal numbers as men. And definitely in Romans, we see Priscilla, we see Mary, we see Tryphena Tryphosa, we see Persis, we see Junia, Rufus's mother, etc. And what's interesting is with this list of 28 Roman Christians, there are 10 women, and I think it's 6 of those women are really identified as being involved with ministry, whereas a lot of the guys, Paul will say, greet this person, but he doesn't say anything about their ministry. And also I think it's 6 women, I could be wrong, but of those 6 women who are mentioned and who are identified as ministering in the church, 2 of them are identified with men as well. So it's Priscilla and Aquila, it's Andronicus and Junia. So we get partnerships. Oh, and also, what's his name? Philo something and Julia, they seem to be a couple as well. Philologus, I think it is. So we see couples, we see women, and there were women doing stuff in Rome. There were women doing stuff in Corinth. There were women doing stuff in Philippi. In fact, Chrysostom really compares Phoebe with Evodiah and Syntyche in Philippians. He thinks they had a similar ministry. And, sorry, I'm probably raving a bit, Chrysostom calls Evodiah and Syntyche the chief of the church in Philippi. That's how he saw these women. And he doesn't use a feminine word there for the chief. So if he had just written the chief in the feminine form, we could argue, oh, well, he's just saying they're the chief women of the church. But he doesn't. He uses the neuter word. So he's just saying in Chrysostom, a Chrysostom is a bishop in Constantinople, a huge church, late 300s, early 400s. So he's reading Philippians and he sees these women in Philippians for Evodiah and Syntyche, and he calls these women the chief of the church and then compares them with Phoebe. So, what were these women doing? I don't know. I have no doubt that they were speaking. Some people sort of look at speaking, especially if it's from a pulpit, especially if it's a certain type of speech, as being the pinnacle of ministry. I don't think that even the first century church saw it that way. So like with Tabitha, the church in Joppa loved Tabitha. They dragged Peter away. You've got to raise this woman to life again. She's so important to our church. And she was caring for widows. So I think this idea that, preaching or teaching, having this kind of role is the pinnacle of Christian ministry. Maybe not all the best way to look at ministry, but I'm sure women did do those things. I'm sure looking at the way that Paul says in Colossians 3:16, 1 Corinthians 14:26, he wants everyone who's gifted and everyone who's not being out of order. If you're sensible and orderly and gifted and you have the Holy Spirit, you can teach, you can prophesy, you can do things. That doesn't, Phoebe was part of that kind of culture, and so were Evadia and Syntyche. That was a lot of talking.
Oh no, I appreciate all the interesting and helpful perspective to all this. So obviously, it appears she's the mail carrier. So maybe that's not as obvious as to many people. Like, what reason is there to think that she's the mail carrier in this passage?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that she's there, that she's turning up in Rome, for starters. So she's from Cenchrea, she's there, and Paul's saying to help her. And where it's positioned in the letter, it's all really big clues that this is the letter carrier. And like I said, no one disagrees with this. Right from the beginning, we have manuscripts from the 10th century that explicitly state, before Romans 16, Phoebe was the letter carrier. The first edition of the King James Bible just plainly states that Phoebe was the letter carrier. This just isn't disputed because Paul's using a formulaic way of introducing her to the church that people would have recognized, okay, she was the letter carrier. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. And so if it wasn't already clear, so you're talking about like, oh, women preaching or talking or teaching or whatever, and that's going to be like, what in the world? Women can't preach. So we're not going to get into that today, but you can check out Mog's articles, like on her website. That'll be in the description, and she's got a whole bunch of different articles on every single question you could ever ask, and from a scholarly perspective. So definitely recommend checking that out. But additionally, on this topic here, so there's also the question of, what was the job of the letter carrier once you get there and all that. So specifically, let's see here. Okay, yeah. So some people have argued that Phoebe would have take the letter there and then get to the church, and she just reads it out loud. That's her job, I guess, of the letter carrier, to read the whole letter to the church. And there's been a number of different reasons why people would say that. But like, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there's a strong possibility that she would have done that?
I've looked at some of the scholarship, especially before when I was doing my master's, because I did my master's on Phoebe and deacons.
Sure.
And I really rely on the scholarship of Peter Head, because he has really looked at letter carriers. That's kind of like his thing. And there is some examples. So he's looked at papyrus letters that name the letter carrier, like Romans does, and that say something about the letter carrier. And sometimes it'll kind of hint that, yes, this letter carrier did read it aloud, but it may not have been, he doesn't think there's enough information and not enough evidence to say, well, that's what routinely happened. But we do have evidence, even in the New Testament, in, is it 1 Clement? Yes, in 1 Clement, where it talks about letter carriers, and it says that, so they would give the letter to the people, but they would explain it, they would elaborate on it. If people had a question, they might, feel that question. So I think it's fair to say that she commented on the letter. I wonder if I can get this quotation up really quickly. I don't, it might take too long. I wonder if I've got it on my screen. Let me get it up because I think it's a pretty cool.
I've got some stuff from Peter Head's article, but
Yeah.
if you have something in particular, go for it.
Yeah, just give me a second. I think it's here. Okay. Longnecker. Is that how you pronounce it, Richard? Longnecker?
Sounds about right.
Yeah. Probably Phoebe should be viewed as the first commentator to others on Paul's letter. And I like this bit. And without a doubt, every commentator, teacher, or preacher on Romans would profit immensely from a transcript of Phoebe's explanations of what Paul wrote in this letter before actually having to speak or write on it themselves. I just kind of like that. Actually, while I've got this open, I'll read this quotation from Robert Jewett. And he says, given the diversity of the several house churches alluded to in Romans 16, providing commentary on Paul's letter would have required formidable political skills on Phoebe's part. In view of the complexity of the argument of the letter, it would also have required interpretive skills. So I think it's fair to say that she commented on the letter. I think what she also undoubtedly would have done is, you know, Priscilla and Aquila were like real buddies with Paul. You know, they lived with each other for years. Their paths crossed so many times. So these guys would have wanted to know all about what Paul was doing. You know, they wanted to catch up with all his news. And I don't know whether Phoebe would have then come back to Paul and then, you know, given the news from Rome. But she was a real representative for Paul, and yeah, she would have been in big demand to speak about Paul's ministry and to comment on Romans.
Yeah. I think so. I've led like Bible studies, just like, you know, with friends and stuff like that, and you know, people be like, "Hey, let's talk about Romans. Let's do a study on Romans," and I'd be like, "I don't have the expertise for that. It is such a complicated and really well-written book. Like, there is." Now, if I had a friend of Paul that could, like, if I'm the Church of Rome, I'm like, hey, Phoebe, could you help us out here? This could you explain any thoughts here would be great if you have. But yeah, you know, so like, I mean, it would make total sense if they were to ask. But I mean, someone like Peter Head, who's written a lot on this, so he stated that often the job of the letter carrier was in some way or other to represent the sender, to expand on details within the letter, and even to expound and reinforce the primary message of the letter in oral communication. So I would assume you agree with this claim. Could you possibly talk about why he came to this conclusion? You've briefly already talked about it. If you want to add anything, we can. And then I've got some quotes I wanted to read to get your feedback about. So yeah, anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, apart from what I've already mentioned, that he's based this on looking at actual letters, and from the much less research that I've done, it sort of matches my description, my observation of what happens. And also, like, the idea that it was routine for a letter carrier to read a letter doesn't even make a real lot of sense for me, considering literacy rates, because not all letter carriers would have been able to read, perhaps. Some may not have been great speakers, because you don't necessarily choose a letter carrier because they can speak well. You choose them because they happen to be going where you want the letter to go or something. There's plenty of letters that are private. You know, there's a few. Yeah, so That it happened, I have no doubt, but that it was a routine accepted practice, that it was a custom,
Hmm.
I do doubt. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that does make a lot of sense. And in Dr. Head's article, I don't know, it wasn't his dissertation. I guess it was just a pretty long article. But like he's just like going through this long list of like just random Greek letters that like, you know, hey Jim, I'm sending my letter carrier Tim over here to help you out and bring you some flour. Tell him I said hi, or whatever. Um, just like all this random stuff, which is like really fun to like get into the mind of
Mm,
the random Greek writer
sure.
there. So, but yeah,
But
no,
then,
like a
yeah,
lot. One of the things in the article specifically was that, there's a number of times where it's like just someone just happens to stumble upon like the guy that wants to write a letter. He's like, "Hey, Tim just happened to be walking by, and he said he was going to Rome, so I sent him a letter with you."
yeah.
So like, there's all kinds of situations where like it didn't really have a ton to do with the like, yeah, as you're saying, the speaking ability. He just happened to be walking by. He seemed to be he's a trusted guy, so it makes sense
Mm.
to send him along. What were you gonna say?
Yeah, I do think Phoebe was a deliberate choice. I don't think she just
Sure.
happened to be going to Rome, even though people do bring up that scenario.
Uh-huh.
But also, like I said, actually in the New Testament, and I don't know if it's Tychicus. Oh no, I think it's actually might be in Colossians. Like Paul says, when you get this letter, these guys, it might be Tychicus and Onesimus, will explain stuff to you. And again, we see that in 1 Clement, where the author of 1 Clement, which is a letter written from Rome to Corinth, he talks about how reliable these people are and how they'll kind of, say extra stuff. Not necessarily read the letter, but they will say something. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I wanted to read some of the, like, this is like the more clear ones where it definitely seems like someone was being tasked to explain the letter or the contents or give more information.
Yeah.
So I'll put it on the screen here. Oh, that didn't work out well. So I'm not going to put it on the screen. um,
Okay.
but yeah, so one was like, it says, "The rest, please learn from the man who brings you this letter. He is no stranger to us." Real simple. He's literally saying, "Hey, please learn from the man who brings you this letter." Um, he's Another one is to enable what was going on in each of the provinces to be reported and known more speedily and promptly. He at first stationed young men at short intervals along the military road, and afterwards post chases. I don't know what that word is. The latter has seemed the more convenient in arrangement, since the same men who bring the dispatches from any place can, if occasion demands, be questioned as well. So he's literally saying, I'm sending you these people. You can question them about the letter and all that's going on. I've sent you through Didymus some sheepskins. The same Didymus will let you know how many of them there are. So even in the letter, he didn't specifically say, hey, these are the amount of sheepskins, like literally saying, hey, you have to ask him if you want to find out. Serapis will tell you about the roses, that I have made every effort to send you as many as you wanted, but we could not find them. So, like, yeah, so these are examples where it seems like the letter carrier is going to be tasked with explaining something, but maybe you've already answered this question, but that doesn't necessarily get us to everybody that was a letter carrier was going to be explaining it. So, and
Yeah.
not only that, but in this letter for Romans, it doesn't specifically say like Phoebe was going to explain it. So, um, maybe you might have to repeat yourself, but like, how do you get from like, these are good examples that a letter carrier might have been expected to explain it, to
Mm.
Phoebe was going to be explaining it?
Sure. Yeah. So papyrus was fairly expensive, and so a lot of papyrus letters are short.
Hmm.
They just say what they need to say, and then in those examples, this guy will tell you exactly how many we need. But Paul goes to great lengths to explain complicated arguments.
Hmm.
Like I said, I think this letter probably went through numerous drafts so that Paul could hone his argument exactly the way that he wanted it to go. I don't think he left bits out and then wanted Phoebe to fill in the blanks. I think Romans is exactly what Paul wanted to say then. That Phoebe maybe helped to explain some of those complicated theological arguments is entirely possible, but I don't think Paul left bits out to be filled in later by the letter carrier.
Okay, so maybe I missed something, but it seemed like you're so maybe I missed something, but it seemed like before you were like, hey, you know, there's a good chance Phoebe would be explaining the letter, but then it seems just now that you said, like, you know, he wouldn't have left bits out, that he was being in detail about it.
Sure. Yeah, I don't think he left bits out, but you know how you were saying before that you wouldn't want to lead a Bible study on Romans, like I feel the same way, because it needs to be explained. Yeah, so I don't think Paul left anything out of his letter, which is unlike that letter where it says, I need, was it the sheepskins or something else? And someone else will tell you exactly how many we need. I don't think Paul left anything out. He wasn't relying on Phoebe to proclaim his message, but Phoebe might have helped to explain some of it.
I see. Okay, so so like he's writing it as a standalone letter. So if Phoebe wasn't there, it's not the end of the world.
Exactly.
But yeah, you know, if Phoebe's there, you might as well explain it right. And it would be kind of weird, like if she didn't explain it. Wouldn't you say, like?
Well, yeah, people might have had questions that, and if Phoebe was hanging around Paul and maybe was sort of somehow in the background of this process, or maybe in the front ground of this process, if Tertius is in her house and Paul and Tertius are working together, writing this letter, getting it down, and it's in Phoebe's house, although we know that Paul was in Gaius's house, so I don't really know how that worked. But yeah, Phoebe would have been hearing what was on Paul's mind at the time. So, like, you know, at the moment I've been looking at a particular topic. So the people around me are hearing what I'm saying about a particular topic because I'm just talking about it. It's something I'm working on. And so what Paul was writing to the Romans was probably coming out in his conversations during the day in Corinth. Does that kind of make sense?
Oh, sure. Yeah. If Paul's talking about it, then it would make sense that Phoebe would hear about it, and if she has a better context of what the you know, what the letter, the topics are going to be about, then yeah, sure. But it's also interesting that, like, I guess from, you know, maybe a more fundamentalist perspective, it's like, hey, you know, women aren't supposed to teach, they're not supposed to lead, and therefore, like, you know, we would expect Phoebe, because she's a woman, to like just not talk about it. Like, you know, I guess there's a scripture or that would require teaching, but like, you know, if any woman, you know, has more information about even a biblical topic, we're going to ask her about it, right? Like, so, you know, I don't see any reason to say like, hey, like, oh yeah, she definitely wouldn't be explaining it, you know, like we don't know for certain, right? But like there isn't a strong reason to say like, hey, yeah, we have no, like, there's no reason why she should be explaining it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
What Paul says generally, rather than what he says specifically to when there's a couple of issues in a couple of churches, when you look at what Paul says generally about ministry, he doesn't differentiate between male ministers and female ministers. So his favourite terms for minister, his very favourite term is co-worker, and he uses that word for women and men. His second favourite word is simply brother or sister. His third favourite term is diakonos, and this is the word that we have for Phoebe, as well as for Paul, as well as Timothy, as well as Tychicus. I don't know if it's Epaphroditus. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of guys who are called diakonos. So Paul's own preferred vocabulary for ministers he uses those words for men and for women. And in his lists of ministries, so there's a list of ministries in Romans 12, 6-8, Ephesians 4, verse 11, 1 Corinthians, maybe 14, 26, I'm not sure. And then other kind of lists in Colossians 3:16. Anyway, there's there's 5 lists of ministries. Teaching is in each one of those, either as a noun or a verb. So teaching is in every one of those. I think that's correct. And those 5 passages in the New Testament, in the Greek New Testament, there is no, okay, these ministries are just for men, these ministries are just for women, these ministries are for everyone. There's none of that. It's just, these are ministries that, the church needs, that God has blessed the church with. And in a couple of those passages that Paul wants all gifted people to participate in. We know women were praying and prophesying in Corinth, and Paul doesn't silence those women. Priscilla corrected the doctrine of an up-and-coming apostle. It says, using a didask word, that Apollos was teaching in Ephesus, and Priscilla and Aquila take him aside. That particular verb can mean a couple of different things. But, they might have, people saying, oh, it wasn't a church. It wasn't a church setting, so it wasn't as authoritative as teaching from a pulpit. But, there weren't pulpits or that kind of idea. So Paul's authority, if he was teaching in a marketplace, if he was teaching in a synagogue, if he was teaching wherever, it didn't change. Paul's speech didn't change depending on the location. The authority, because it comes down to authority, and I hate it that it comes down to authority, but that's what people are stuck on. Some people are stuck on. The authority which Paul had to speak didn't change depending on the venue. And so the idea that Priscilla's total teaching of Apollos doesn't count because it wasn't in a church, and it might have even been in a church. We don't know it because it's quite vague. They took him aside, which can also mean they took him into their home, which can also mean they took him into his home church, into their home church. We don't know where this venue was. That doesn't mean that, Priscilla taught Apollos there on a once-only thing and then didn't teach a whole bunch of other times. I don't know if that was too garbled, but, the prominence that both Luke in Acts and Paul in his letters gives Priscilla is a big indication that this woman had a ministry that included teaching. I have no doubt about that. Chrysostom has no doubt about that. Other historians, people who have come to the text without a theological axe to grind, they look at the text and they say, Priscilla was teaching. You can quibble about the words, you can quibble about the location on this one event in Acts 18, but I have no doubt that on numerous other occasions she was teaching in her house church. Priscilla and Aquila had a house church in Ephesus and in Rome.
Yeah.
And so because Priscilla's doing it, there's no reason why other women weren't doing it, especially in churches associated with Paul. Paul got this really bad reputation as a misogynist, and yet he's championing women. He's championing women in Romans 16, saying really nice things about them, the loved one.
Yeah, no, that is really cool. Yeah, so we already so you mentioned something along the lines of we don't see any of these established, I guess, positions saying that women can't do them. So of course, a lot of people are gonna be like, oh, this passage, specifically First Timothy 3 talks about deacons and I guess elders, or however you want to translate that. Um, and a lot of people would say, okay, so this passage on First Timothy 3 prohibits women from being deacons, and therefore, she's not going to be that's not how we should translate the passage. Maybe we should translate servant. So before we get into this whole servant deacon language idea, can we first talk about First Timothy 3? Like, what is your interpretation of that? Give us your quick little argument for why
Yeah.
that should be not a good reason to say that women can't be deacons.
Yeah, I think, and I'm not alone, Clement of Alexandria and Chrysostom and a whole bunch of other people through the centuries look at 1 Timothy 3, it's around verse 12, I think, and say, here's proof that women were deacons. Okay, so at this point in time, there wasn't a separate word for male deacons and female deacons. It's exactly the same word, diakonos.
Hmm.
And so Paul has just listed the moral qualifications of diakonoi, of deacons.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't even, again, here we don't hear what they're doing. Even with the episcopoi, the overseers at the top, we don't hear really what they're doing. But Paul wanted all these people to be respectable, because the church is new. The church is controversial in some ways, in a very hostile society that was suspicious of new Christian movements. And so Paul wants the leaders of these churches, the ministers of these churches, to be respectable people. So he outlines moral qualifications for male deacons, and then he just mentions women. And again, like, not just me, I'm really sure that they're female deacons. And so we have this little phrase, in the same way. So he's just said, whoever aspires to be an overseer, etc. You've got to abide by these certain moral qualifications. In the same way, deacons, male deacons, and then in the same way, women. He's not talking about wives of deacons. So in this passage, we don't have qualifications for the wives of the overseers, because almost all of the overseers at that time would have been men. But here, obviously, in Ephesus, there were male and there were female diakonoi, but Paul just calls them women here to differentiate them from the men. Yeah.
Okay.
I could have explained that better, but yeah.
Well, if you want to give it another go, you totally can.
So it's this structure, overseers in the same way, deacons in the same way. This structure that's in this passage is what's usually highlighted in these discussions. And because there wasn't a word that meant deaconess at this point in time, the first recorded mention of the word diakonissa, which is deaconess, is in 325 in one of the canons of Nicaea. So up until this time, all the women deacons are still just called diakonos. And we can tell if they're women usually because there's a feminine article in front of it, or there's a name, or there's the word actually woman deacon. But here it's just women. Bottom line is, I'm pretty sure, and there's a whole bunch of other people that are pretty sure, that we're talking about women ministers here.
Interesting. Okay. And so obviously a big one for a lot of people is, well, this one must be faithful to his wife.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to look at a different translation here. Isn't this the
like
husband of one wife passage?
Can you get the NRSV for me?
NRSV?
Yeah,
Sure.
because I think they're spot on. Controversial, but I think they're spot on.
Okay. Oh, where are we at? All right. I can't get the NRSV. How about the NRSV UE?
I think that's right. Yeah. Where is it?
Deacons be married only once.
Once, yeah. So literally, I have this growing list of quotations from ancient texts, how the early church fathers, how ancient documents mention this, and that's how they understand it. Not only do they think they should be married only once, a lot of these people who are married only once are actually widows. And so I have a growing list in one of my articles on this verse. And yesterday I added one from the Didascalia Apostolorum, where they're talking about ordaining bishops, and they're saying preferably he shouldn't be married, he shouldn't have a wife, but he can be married only once. But the implication in the next phrase is that he's a widow, because it says so that he can sympathise with widows, which doesn't make sense if he's married. So there's a whole bunch, Jerome, Tertullian, who else? You know, like the big names. They understand this particular phrase, which is used 4 times it's used 3 times in 1 Timothy, it's used once in Titus. They understand, and it's used for men 3 times, and it's used for women once. That it's talking about someone who has only been married once and who probably is now actually a widow. So very controversial, but that's how the early church seems to have understood it. Quite early on, there was a really big sense that church leaders should be single, which is really different to today. Very different to today. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, people can certainly interpret Paul that way. But yeah, definitely different than today. But if it wasn't already clear, so a lot of translations will have husbands of one wife. So like, well, a husband of one wife, well, clearly that can't be a woman because a woman cannot be a husband. So what Ms. Mowczko is saying that, we've got some early church fathers that interpreted that as, marrying only once. And, for more on that discussion, you can check out her articles. And we've actually done some videos on that topic too as well. But
I'll just quickly add something too. There wasn't a gender-inclusive way of saying that particular phrase. So when it's only about women, it's wives of one husband, and that's in 1 Timothy 5. And when it's mostly about men, or primarily about men, it's, am I saying it the right thing? Husband of one wife. So there wasn't a way of sort of combining it. But Chrysostom actually says, talking about this phrase in the context of deacons, that it applies to women.
Right. Yeah.
And Chrysostom, born and bred Greek speaker. Yeah. He specifically says that this phrase, husbands of one wife, applies to female deacons.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It really is an interesting phrase because there's plenty of resources all throughout history of deacons that were women. So
totally. Yeah.
So it's really interesting, like, if we're going to like read the text like super literally, that like so many people got it wrong, or maybe there's a different meaning to it. But moving on there, so people got your general idea of how you interpret that. So that's the reason why that's for you. That's 1 Timothy 3 is not a reason to reject women being deacons, but there's still a debate in Romans 16 about how to translate that. And so there's the question of, should we translate Phoebe as a servant or a deacon? Some people would even say deaconess, but that's like super rare. So what is your I guess, what is the good reasons to interpret as servant? What are the good reasons to interpret as deacon? And what's your opinion on all that?
Yeah. So I guess it depends how you understand the word servant. Because like I said, if you're going to be consistent, if you're going to call all the diakonoi servants, because there is that aspect of service in ministry. Ministry is service, service is ministry. One of the first things I ever did when I got my Strongs, like many, many years ago, was look up the verb diakoneo, because I wanted to see if there was a difference between ministering, and service, and there isn't, especially in Paul's letters. Ministry is service, service is ministry. So if you want to call Phoebe and Paul and Timothy servants, fine, but be consistent. But my preferred understanding of this word, and this is based on some of the scholarship of John Collins, is that a diakonos was often a go-between, an agent. And when Paul uses it, these diakonoi are an agent of God or an agent of Christ, or in Phoebe's case, an agent of the church. They are agents with a sacred commission. And so whenever I see Paul using the word diakonos, I have this sort of impression of they are agents with a sacred commission. But you can't sort of use that word when you're translating the Bible. You need one word. I actually don't like the word deacon because of all the baggage that comes on after in the history of the church. What a deacon is in a Pentecostal church is really different to what a deacon is in a high Anglican church, and it's really different to what maybe deacons are in a whole bunch of other churches, assuming they even have deacons. A lot of churches don't even have people they call deacons.
Yeah.
But the word deacon itself is a bit of a problem, and it's very different to what deacons are in the Roman Catholic Church as well, which is kind of like, yeah. Anyway, so it's a real shame that we have to translate it. I wish we could just leave it as diakonos. I wish we could just leave it as Paul's word and then let people see how Paul uses it. So just to expand on that a little bit, so Paul uses the word 21 times in his letters, almost always with the sense of an agent with a sacred commission. But even the exceptions kind of prove the rule. So like these agents of Satan, like these false apostles, and they're sort of agents with a diabolical commission. And there's another verse where Paul asks this rhetorical question, is Jesus a diakonos of sin? Is Jesus an agent of sin? And of course, no, the answer to that is no. And even in Romans, again, we're in Romans, Phoebe's in Romans, Paul uses the word for sort of government ministries. And Paul says that a government ministry is the diakonos of God for justice. So again, even a non-Christian diakonos can be an agent with a sacred commission. And, if we could just translate all of Paul's uses as agent with a sacred commission or agents with a diabolical commission, that would, I think, encapsulate the meaning. Nijay Gupta suggests the meaning of ministry provider for people like Phoebe. I think that's great. I've started using that because I think that really, it's not specific, so it can cover a whole bunch of ministries, which is exactly what I think diakonoi did. I think they did what was needed. And that could have meant teaching, preaching. Preaching in the New Testament, though, is proclamation of the gospel to people outside of the church, basically. So teaching, we see in some like kind of still early church writings, but not the New Testament, that they visited people in prison, they bribed prison guards so that Christians could get better treatment. Again, that they delivered letters. This is something that diakonoi do. So they were doing stuff that needed to be done, whatever that was. So ministry provider, agent with a sacred commission, it works, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think for a lot of people, the idea is like, hey, if we can say that Phoebe was a deacon, that means we can say a woman is a formal, I guess, leader of some kind in the church. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? Like, you'd say she's a ministry provider. You'd still say she was some type of leader, some type of, like some type of formal position of some kind, you would say, or maybe there didn't have any formal positions at all. What are your thoughts there?
It's really hard to know when. So by the end of the 1st century, definitely. If you read 1 Clement, again, I've been mentioning that a lot. If you read the Didache, or Didache, however you want to pronounce it, if you read Ignatius' letters around 110, we get deacons as an office, as a title. So here's another thing with Paul. When Paul describes Phoebe, when Paul describes Timothy, when Paul describes Epaphroditus, he doesn't just say, this is a deacon. It's usually like 2, 3, sometimes 4 ministry descriptions. For him, diakonos is a description. It's not a formal title, maybe around this time. We see in Philippians 1:1, Paul does something unusual. He addresses his letter not just to the whole church, because all his other letters are just to the Christians in Corinth, to the Christians in Rome, to the Christians in Thessalonica. But in Philippians, he addresses the church to the Christians, and then he kind of almost tags on overseers and deacons. And so that was, I think, the mid-50s, almost around the same time as Romans was written. So maybe just now things were starting to get a bit more formalised, but I think it's still too early to say. I think still in the 50s, Christians were working things out. And what, the church was doing in Syria was different to what the church was doing in Ephesus, and was different to what the church was doing in Corinth. So, yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that makes sense. So that maybe you mentioned it, but say like 1 Timothy 3. So a lot of people would say like, hey, you have overseers. These are the qualifications for overseers. These are the qualifications for deacons. So at this time, do you think that these are formal positions?
Kind of, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So that's just, a little bit later, and then the whole process of early Christianity and maybe Phoebe's time, they're not as formal positions, is what you'd say.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Okay. All righty. So you're not prepared for, well, maybe you are prepared for this. I didn't, give you this question in advance, so it's okay if you're not prepared. But so like the NET translation, they have a footnote. It says, Epaphras is associated with the church in Colossians and is called diakonos in Colossians 1:7, but no contemporary translation regards him as a deacon. And then 1 Timothy 4:6, Paul calls Timothy a diakonos, but Timothy was associated with the church in Ephesus, but he obviously was not a deacon. That's what it says. So I know you have specific qualifications, like in Paul's writing, it seems like a specific position. Would you consider these two passages of Epaphras and Timothy as those are formal positions? And like, do you go against the majority there, or what are your thoughts there?
I think that those passages are really helpful in understanding Phoebe. Like I said, if you understand that the term means an agent with a sacred commission, that's what Phoebe was.
Okay.
And these guys are delivering letters as well, which is what Phoebe was doing. So, I wouldn't call those guys deacons, in the same way that I'm a little bit reluctant to call Phoebe a deacon as well. I do use that word because other people use that word, so but I just think ministry provider, again, Nijay Gupta's word, covers it. Great, that's a good word. But these people were recognised. These people were on the front lines of ministry. They were doing sometimes dangerous work. Being a Christian was dangerous. Christians were being killed. Paul killed Christians before he became a Christian himself. So I just think we need to just kind of get a better understanding of what church life was like in the 1st century. It was difficult. It was dangerous. There were threats. There were constant threats. Junior, a woman, was in prison. Other women were imprisoned and tortured and goodness knows what, because terrible things happened in prison. It was tough. And women were there. Women were there side by side with men a lot of the time, doing important stuff. And I know, we were talking about, I was talking about, we think of teaching and preaching as sort of the pinnacles of Christian ministry. And we think it looks a certain way. I have no doubt that people like Junia and Priscilla, no doubt, were speaking, spreading the gospel, ministering in so many in vocal ways. But it may not have looked like what happens on a Sunday service in the morning. And yet it can still be a kind of precedent for what precedent, I should say, on what happens on a Sunday morning, because if women could do whatever back then, and I do think they did whatever back then, they just ministered where there was a need. I think a gifted, capable, godly woman can do whatever is needed today. And sometimes that does mean standing up behind a pulpit and giving a great sermon.
Okay. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense about the whole deacon stuff. I guess one thing that I guess you want to emphasize there is that, so while might not be a formal position, like, what we call today specifically, and most importantly, but she's also not just merely a servant. So not some type of slave in any way.
Yeah, she had money. She was a prostatus. So straight away we know she had servants in the way we ordinarily understand the word servants. This woman had money. Like I said, I think she is a real contender for being the person who funded Paul's letter, if not the sole provider, at least contributed towards that. And she was not, this little, and I don't want to say little because, you know what I mean. She was a prominent woman.
Yeah. So on that word prostatus, so that is translated a number of different things in different translations. So you have helper, benefactor, patron, leader. Could you explain the reasoning for it against like each position? What your thoughts on the whole? Obviously, it seems like you think she's a benefactor or some type of patron, but what do you think about all that?
Yeah, I think everyone, now that we've got Greek databases, so we can quickly look up words to see how they're used across the board in a whole bunch of Greek literature and inscriptions and papyri. We have got a wealth of information at our fingertips. I don't think no one is disputing that prostatus means patron or benefactor. Okay. So there are a couple of manuscripts that have changed prostatus. I think it was into parastatus, which does mean helper. But it's a bit like Eve as helper in Genesis 2. Right. Helper didn't really quite cut it. We're talking about something much more significant. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So if maybe just a little bit like, so let's leader. Okay. So I think Philip Payne's a big advocate of that. What reason would there be, do you think, not to translate it as leader? If you're against that position, I would assume you are.
Because Paul says that Phoebe was a prostatus of many and of myself, and I don't think Paul was saying that Phoebe led Paul. I think Paul is really saying Phoebe sponsored Paul, to use more modern, and I think that's what it means.
Okay.
Because there are other words. Okay, so here's the other thing. So that's based. Prostatus is the noun. The verb is proistemi, which is used in some of these ministry passages in 1 Timothy 3. I think it occurs 2, maybe even 3 times. I'm trying to think where else it occurs. So proistemi occurs, I'm going to say 8. It's roughly about 8 times in Paul's letters in the context of people ministering to the church. And this word is translated as leading sometimes, but proistemi has a combined meaning of leading and caring. So if you're proistemiing people in 1 Timothy 3, you're not just leading, you're providing for them. So the noun prostatus and the related verb proistemi. Trying to think of an exact verse. I think it's in where Paul says that an overseer needs to be able to care for the church, and if he can't even care for his own household, that verse. So that the verb's used there, and it's not just about leading; it's about providing, and so we do get this kind of combination of thought between leading and providing in this family in prostatus and in proistemi. So I have an article about that where I look at this combined meaning of if you're a prostatus, you are kind of leading because you're the guy or the girl with the goods, and if you've got the goods, the other people have to kind of kowtow to you a little bit, and there were sort of mutual obligations. I mean, you were really good to your patron. You did what they said, basically. In the first century, you said nice things about them. You reciprocated it. So in the first century, a patron didn't just give a gift. There was obligations involved. It was just I think Seneca said it was the chief bond. Patronage was the chief bond of humanity, because everyone was dependent on someone, and there was this reciprocation involved. And this kind of custom of patronage was just entrenched and pervasive in the first century, and necessary because there was a little bit of social welfare if you're in Rome, but like really not much. People relied on people with money, so you got into the good graces of people with money, and
Right. Yeah, and then I would assume there's some type of honor factor there too.
Totally.
Yeah. So Nick Quinn, I don't know if you're familiar with the name.
Sure. We used to chat quite a lot.
Oh, that's fun. So he asked, he mentioned the verbal form of prostatus in Romans 12:48 says the one's teaching. Does that give you any indication? I mean, it is a few chapters afterwards.
I think it's the one, the verbal form of prostatus is in that, but it's not for the one's teaching. It's for the one's leading, maybe. Because the one's teaching would just be a didask word. Yeah.
I've got it pulled up here. Let's see.
Yeah, I'll put it up too. Hang on, I've got that Greek. Can you take it here? You see this word?
Didaskon, yeah. I'll share it on my screen here. Oops. Of course, you can pull it up there as well. But diaconia, which is service, or didaskon, teaching, didaskolia. I mean, do you think that helps us at all in this conversation?
Not yet. We need to go down. There it is.
Okay.
Proistamenos.
Okay.
The one leading with diligence. And so that could well be providing. And we've just had giving. Now we've got proistamenos, and then we've got mercy. So it's even sort of, side by side with sort of generosity, if you like.
Yeah. So it's not foolproof, but it seems like they're associated in some way. Would you say?
Sorry?
Would you say like they're associated with each other in some way?
Teaching and prostatus?
Yeah, I don't know. Do you?
No, I don't actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
I think prostatus, you can connect it with leading.
Yeah.
But it's about provision as well.
Okay. So I guess to answer his question then, what do you think about this? Does this give you much input into the conversation as far as how we're interpreting prostatus in Romans 12?
Well, it's a ministry. Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question exactly.
Well, like, so when you're making arguments for a position and all that kind of stuff, like you want to look at similar usage of a word and similar context, and if the same word is used 2 verses earlier, it seems like there's a good chance that maybe it has the same meaning here. Now, this is of course a few chapters earlier, so maybe not as close, but
Yeah, so if we look at where prostomenos is in that list in Romans 12:6-8, like I said, it comes after giving, is giving a position, and then it comes just before showing mercy. Is showing mercy a position? I don't know. And also as far as teaching is concerned, there's another verse in Romans. I'm going to say Romans 15:14, but I could be way off.
Okay.
And it doesn't use the didask words, it uses a different word, but it says you should all be able to instruct each other. So, Paul's really into collaborative ministry, into participation, into people just doing what they can do. Yeah, it's not about necessarily positions, but I do think Phoebe had a recognised position or a recognised role. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that would make sense.
She was an official deacon. She might have been. She might have been an official deacon. But, Tychicus wasn't. Epaphras wasn't. Apparently, maybe they were. Who knows?
Yeah. I mean, of course, you can use the word. You can call her a servant, and she could still be a deacon. But maybe this isn't a specific reason to say that she was specifically the formal position deacon. But yeah, so and that's just the lovely specific, I guess, aspects of language here that make things difficult. So enough of the prostatus talk, unless you want to add something there. In the discussion of like Phoebe, women in ministry, and all that stuff, as we're closing things out here, what would you say is the takeaway for some people? So you said that this isn't a good enough reason to say, hey, women. This specific instance is not a good reason to say, hey, women can have an official office in the church. I would assume that's still your position, right?
Yeah, I would say that, yeah.
Yeah, and so if not that, but it seems like you would say she led in some way. What is the takeaway? What input do you think this should have into the women in ministry discussion?
Okay. So the very fact that Phoebe is a diakonos, the very fact that Paul just says these nice things about her, the fact that she's in Rome as Paul's representative, shows that this woman was really doing stuff. And for Paul, anyone, male or female could be a diakonos, male or female could be one of his ministry colleagues, a co-worker. Anyone could be among the apostles, which is a whole other ballgame, which I know you addressed the other day with Nick. And with his list of ministries, it's not women can't do proestamenos, women can't do teaching, women can't do this. There's none of that. There's none of that in Paul's general teaching on ministry. The only time he says that men and women, because he shuts men down as well, is when they're misbehaving and when they're saying rubbish and when they need to learn. So my takeaway is that Phoebe is just one of many women in Paul's network that were doing amazing work, that was spreading the gospel and spreading the message of Jesus.
That's really cool. All right, so of course people should check out your Facebook. Well, I guess your Facebook as well. You post a lot on there as well. But your website. You have you written any books? I'm not familiar.
No, I'm so bad at that. I've started to. I'm so motivated to do what I do on my blog,
Uh-huh.
and all that goes with that. I'm really unmotivated. I probably will.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
you've clearly written enough on the blog to make a book out of it if you wanted to. Uh, but yeah, so yeah, I would recommend everybody check out her work. She's got an answer for everything on her blog, and I really do appreciate you coming on here. Of course, you've written on so much, we'll have to have you on again. But I really do appreciate it, and otherwise, I do hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Zach. Thanks, it's been
Awesome.
great.
Yeah, much appreciated.